Welcome, folks. It's very good to have you with us. I think we'll make a start. I'd like to welcome you very warmly indeed to St John's for our Lent lecture for 2021. Many of you know that we've had a Lent lecture at St John's every year since 2012. Our speakers are always eminent in their fields. We've had people from all walks of life. We've had scientists, politician, geologist. We had a comedy writer last year. We had an artist working in the visual arts a couple of years ago. We've never before had a historian, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we've got a historian tonight to speak to us on the theme of God and history, and specifically on the story of one man who gave his all. Great to have you. My name's Andrew Mcclellan. I'm the vicar of St John's. In case you're not sure which is our church building, it's the one pictured behind me. I'm not actually sitting in the middle of Park Road at the moment. It's my virtual background. So much for St John's. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Robert Lyman, and Rob's a writer. He's a historian. He's a former British Army officer. He's published widely on the Second World War in Europe and in North Africa and in Asia. He's been the BBC's historical advisor for V-Day commemorations last year and in 2015. He's a regular contributor to documentary films on aspects of the Second World War. He's currently working on a new narrative account of the war in the Far East, and at the same time on another book about American experiences of living under Nazism, and a combined biography of Slim and Montgomery, Britain's greatest generals of the Second World War. Rob is the military biographer of Viscount Slim. He's also an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And the reason we have him as a lecturer for our church lecture is because Rob is also a Christian. He became a Christian as a boy at the age of 11, having heard a soul-searching sermon in his local church. He's now a committed member of Waltham St Lawrence Parish Church in rural Berkshire. His vicar is Charles Mason, who's also with us tonight, and Charles' son Ed and granddaughter Susanna and daughter-in-law Laura are members of St John's, so the link is there. Rob, it's great to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming to us this evening. And I'm going to say welcome to our Lent lecturer, and we'd like to greet our speaker, everyone, with a round of applause.
It's a very great pleasure for me to be with you tonight. Thank you very much, Andrew, for your overly kind words of welcome. It's always very interesting to hear the introduction to speakers, and you've egged me up fantastically. So thank you very much for that. But it is a really great pleasure to be with you at St John's tonight, and in particular to be able to give the Lent address. If you could just make sure that you're all muted, that will be absolutely fantastic as well, and we'll see how it goes. Well, I don't need to tell you tonight that Lent is a time when Christians look forward to Easter. It's when we reflect on the 40 days that Christ spent in the wilderness before his trial and crucifixion. And during this time, many people voluntarily give up eating something to mirror Christ's fasting during this period in the desert. It reminds us of the small sacrifice he was making of not eating so that he could pray, which then led to the very great sacrifice he was about to make at the cross. At Easter, we remember how Christ sacrificed everything for us. He willingly gave up his all, every aspect of his humanity, his life even, in an act that placated a God angry at human sin. By this sacrifice, all sinners who repent can be reconciled with God. As we ponder this in 2021, we ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice? Not merely for Lent this year, but for the extension of God's kingdom. Some chocolate, perhaps, or perhaps some alcohol. Our efforts can seem paltry in comparison, do they not? In the Gospel of John, Christ tells his disciples, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Jesus was talking about what he knew would take place at the cross and drawing attention to the reality that this deliberate act of sacrifice was the greatest act of love and devotion one person could ever show for another. As all men and women are made in the image of God, we too are capable of acts of great sacrifice. Now, at Lent this year, we aren't being asked to give up everything, certainly not our lives. Although, of course, even in our modern age, every day, Christians across the world suffer and die for their faith. Tonight, I want to tell you the story of the sacrifice one young soldier made during Lent exactly 77 years ago in the jungle-covered hills of Assam in the far northeast of India. He made a sacrifice of a kind we aren't being made to make in this audience at Lent this year, but it was a sacrifice soldiers are routinely asked to make, and which this young man made willingly when his country asked him to face its enemies. The young man's name was Captain John Young. He was born in Glasgow in August 1919 and attended Hillhead High School before leaving school to become a bank clerk. Like so many other young men of his generation, he realized that war was inevitable and worried about the threat of Nazism to Europe. In May 1939, he joined the Glasgow Highlanders, the Territorial Army Battalion of the Highland Light Infantry. He proved to be a natural soldier. Within weeks of joining the army, he was promoted to Lance Corporal, and by the end of 1939, by which time, of course, war had been declared, he had been promoted again to Corporal. Before the end of 1940, John Young had reached the rank of Sergeant and had become an instructor. The Highland Light Infantry was the Glasgow Regiment, and a sergeant in that unit of the British Army needed excellent soldiering and man management skills and considerable strength of character. To have reached and held the rank of sergeant in that short time, John Young must have been an exceptional soldier. He was clearly a natural leader, and in March 1941, he was commissioned and made an officer in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Well, Young completed officer training and in 1942 was put in charge of a draft of men aboard a troop ship bound for India. When he arrived in Bombay in July, he was sent across the entire length of India to Shillong in Assam, in the far northeast of the country, where he joined the newly raised 1st Battalion of the Assam Regiment. This was a new formation raised in 1941, comprising locally raised Indian troops and non-commissioned officers with British officers. He became the officer commanding of A Company. Now, the men who made up the Assam Rifles were local tribesmen. Many were Nagas, people of 16 different tribes who populated the hills between the Brahmaputra Valley and the Chindwan. There were perhaps 200,000 Nagas in 1939. Now, much of this territory was unexplored and unmapped, even by the 1930s, and many more remote Nagas still practiced their tribal custom of headhunting. They did this because they believed that the spiritual power contained in each head was transferred to the new owner when it was removed from the previous owner's shoulders. It didn't much matter whether the person who lost their head was a warrior or a child. Christian missionaries, most of them American, had arrived in India from the 1870s onwards, and large numbers of Nagas had subsequently become Christians. The hills weren't formally part of the British Empire. Instead, if Naga villagers asked for protection for themselves from their headhunting neighbours, the British Deputy Commissioner for the Hill Tribes would usually oblige. For a small tax to pay for security in the form of the Assam Rifles, a local militia, villagers received British protection and were enabled to live peaceably among their neighbours. It was in this way that the Raj crept slowly into the hills. The result has been that the Nagas, particularly along the main route into Manipur, were both predominantly Christian and supportive of British rule. When I stay in Kohima, I go every year, I'm awoken in the early hours of the morning by the sound of the local tribal prayer meeting next door. Powerful evangelical Christianity is very strong in Nagaland today. Now, the northeast of India was, at the time when John arrived in 1942, a long way from the war. I have no doubt that he would have believed that he was in for an uneventful posting. The Japanese had invaded Southeast Asia in December 1941, and by June 1942 had thrown the British out of Burma entirely. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the Assam Regiment, and not much else, found itself between the Japanese in Burma and the rest of India. I'm just going to stop here and point you to the map. So on the right-hand side is northern Burma. The Chindwin River is clearly denoted on the screen and marks the border between Burma on the right and India on the left. And the northern part of the map on the left is Assam, and the southern part, where Imphal is the capital, is called Manipur. And you can see those jungled hills. And from the Chindwin across to Dimapur in the Brahmaputra Valley, you can't see the river, I'm afraid, on this photograph from Google Maps or Google Earth, but the Brahmaputra River is just to the north of the photograph. But the distance between the Chindwin and Dimapur is probably about 140 miles. And you can see very clearly those hills. And the hills, in the Naga Hills, as they're called, sometimes the Somra Tracks, rise to about 6,000 or 6,500 feet. Now, these hills that I've described, which had become John Young's home, suddenly became the front line in the war in the east. The role of the Assam Regiment was to protect the villages that ran east from the mountaintop town of Kohima. The Burmese border, denoted by the Chindwin River, ran about 120 miles to the east. The battalion's life was taken up with patrolling the paths up to the Chindwin, the men trying to work out what, if anything, the Japanese were doing. There was no indication in the early days, certainly, that the Japanese had any plans to invade India. Not, that is, until December 1943, when the British began receiving reports that the Japanese were preparing to do precisely that. In March 1944, the Japanese launched a massive invasion of India, their so-called March on Delhi, led by the man who had captured Singapore, General Mutaguchi Renya. An entire division, about 20,000 men, was to march in the northern part of the operation across the Naga Hills to take Kohima in two columns of about 10,000 men each. And by so doing, to prevent the British from sending troops through the hills from the Brahmaputra Valley via Kohima down into the base at Imphal. Unfortunately, Kohima was poorly defended. As I've suggested, the British had known for some months that a Japanese attack was likely, but they never considered that an attack would be as powerful as it turned out to be. At Kohima, there was a scratch force comprising a recently arrived British Territorial Battalion, the 4th Battalion, the Royal West Kents, most of the Assam Regiment, of which John Young was a member, and large numbers of administrative troops whose day job was to keep the line of communication, that is the road working from Dimapur through the mountains to Imphal. The town was not prepared for defense. In total, there were probably about 1,500 British and Indian troops in and around the place, with no more than about 800 men trained to fire a rifle. Now, in order to report on or disrupt a Japanese advance, in mid-March 1944, the 1st Battalion, the Assam Regiment, and its 500 soldiers was tasked with the defense of the villages of Jessamy and Karasom. Jessamy was 45 miles east of Kohima, and Karasom south of Jessamy. It was a 75-mile journey from Kohima to Karasom. And these photographs depict, or are of, the beautiful Naga town or village, actually, well, it's a sprawling town nowadays, of Karasom. Thus, the battalion found itself on its own at the northern tip of the British defences of India, in what had been considered to be a very quiet location, as the British staff had ruled out any possibility of an advance of more than a Japanese regiment, perhaps 3,000 men, through the rugged and remote hills. The commanding officer of the battalion, a man called Colonel Bruno Brown, sent the 100 men of John Young's A Company south to Karasom, and where he was instructed to carry out the construction of defences for the village, whilst the remainder of the battalion dug in to the north at Jessamy. Well, when he got to Karasom, John Young did exactly as he was told, built defences denoted on the map on the right. Above, on the hillside, above the main road that ran from Jessamy in the north and then swung back around to a place called Malsansong on the main road back to Kohima. So his position, dug in over the hills, dominated the primary road junction leading south to the next major village called Ukral and then to Imphal. So it was a strategic position, very well identified by John Young, very clear when you visit the place today that it's the only location where a defense could and should be located. Young stocked ammunition, water and food for a battle that he thought would take 3 or 4 days. In the meanwhile, the Naga inhabitants of the village made arrangements to hide their livestock and possessions, and a number of them fled into the hills. Jock Young then sent out some reconnaissance patrols. So I have called him John Young. He was known in the battalion as Jock. Reconnaissance patrols moved east into the hills and into Burma itself, discovering recent activity by the Japanese. Now, John Young's orders were to stop or delay the Japanese advance through the hills onto Kohima. What he didn't know, and what no one knew, was that his 100 men at Karasom faced perhaps 10,000 battle-hardened troops under one of their most famous and aggressive generals, General Sato, approaching in that sector of the hills. He was ordered to fight, his instructions said, to the last man and the last bullet. But however extraordinary these orders were, he didn't question them. This was what he had trained to do ever since he had joined the Glasgow Highlanders nearly 5 years before. Nor did his mainly Naga troops. This wasn't a war they fully understood, but they had joined the Indian army willingly and were determined to defend their hills from the invader. They were well trained, well disciplined, and entirely loyal to Captain John Young. Young knew that every hour granted to the defenders at Kohima to dig trenches and bunkers, set up barbed wire and gun positions, and in general prepare for the Japanese assault was critical. And he knew that in Kohima they were depending on him and his men to hold the Japanese at Karasom for as long as possible. Eventually, on the 26th of March 1944, one of his patrols returned with the news that what looked like to be 1,000 enemy soldiers were coming along the track from the south from Ukral. At 6 o'clock the following morning, Young telephoned Jessamy to report that at least a battalion of Japanese infantry with pack mules plus elephants carrying and pulling guns and mortars were approaching his position. That was the last time that anybody outside Karasom ever spoke to Young, as the telephone line was then cut by the enemy. These Japanese troops were advancing from Ukral in the south, and they appeared not to know that Karasom was garrisoned by men of the Assam Regiment. Now, when the enemy column marched along the road immediately below A Company's position, Young ordered his troops to open fire. The Japanese, entirely taken by surprise, suffered very heavy casualties. But they reacted quickly by making a series of attacks on A Company's trenches and bunkers. Casualties were immediately incurred, the Japanese countering with frontal attacks and mortars. The Japanese pulled back at noon, but attacked again at dusk, again failing to penetrate the defensive perimeter. This pattern was repeated for the next 3 days, with the Japanese making fanatical frontal attacks, but always being repulsed by the defenders. To vent their spleen, the Japanese burnt down Karasom village, the Naga inhabitants looking on with anger and despair from the surrounding jungle. On the 31st of March, a new column of Japanese with mules and elephants was seen approaching Karasom again from the south, from Ukhrul. Young knew that his men were too exhausted to effectively resist these fresh troops, and his water supply was almost finished. He had lost contact with his commanding officer in Jessamy earlier in the battle, when mortar fire had killed his second in command and destroyed his radio link, and he was unaware that the order to fight to the last man and the last bullet had been rescinded. He knew, though, that the Japanese were working around and beyond his position. He knew that to sacrifice his remaining men would, however, serve no purpose. So he called his senior non-commissioned officers together. After thanking them for their bravery and unwavering commitment, he ordered them to escape back through the hills to Kohima. He would remain. He told them that his orders were to fight to the last man and to the last bullet. He had decided that he would be the last man and that he would fire the last bullet. Despite their desperate objections, Captain Young insisted, and that night his men melted away into the darkness. Young remained at his post. The last time they saw him, he was stacking ammunition and hand grenades, preparing for the next Japanese attack. The following morning, Naga villagers heard heavy firing from the area, followed by the crump of hand grenades, and then silence. Most of Young's men made it back to Kohima and took part in the following battle and the eventual defeat of the Japanese. One of his soldiers, whom I had the privilege to meet in Kohima some years ago, Sovahu Ninus, shown here on the slide, last saw Young standing in his bunker on the morning of March the 31st, 1944, quietly and calmly awaiting the Japanese assault. Young's selflessness not only saved the lives of his remaining soldiers, but added probably 5 days to the frantic efforts to prepare Kohima for defense, something that was successfully achieved, for it was at Kohima that the Japanese invasion of India was halted. No one saw Young die, except, of course, the Japanese, who honored the remarkable heroism of this man with a warrior's burial. The villagers of Karasom later told Sir Charles Pawsey, the deputy commissioner of the Naga Hills at the time, that the Japanese were so impressed with his conduct that they shaved his head and buried him with full military honors in the style of a samurai. Pawsey commented, "There is no question that their stand, the stand of the Assam regiment in the last days of March, gave time for something to be got ready at Kohima. They saved Kohima and India." The battle that followed at Kohima was one of the great turning point battles of the Second World War, for it was in this mountaintop town that the Japanese invasion of India was stopped, and the start of Japan's military contraction began. It was an old-style war of mud, blood, and bullets that reminded many of those who had fought in the First World War of the Somme or of Passchendaele. Its strategic significance was that, as you saw on the map, Kohima blocked the only access route available to the Japanese to move into India. If Kohima were held, the Japanese offensive would fail. The battle was in two parts. The first, when the garrison of 1,500 men, the 1,500 men that I described, held off perhaps 15,000 Japanese over a 3-week period, is often known for the Battle of the Tennis Court. The battle to regain those parts of Kohima seized by the Japanese then raged for a further 6 weeks. It was one of Japan's greatest ever defeats and precipitated the end of their military ambitions in Asia. So John Young's sacrifice was remarkable and played a significant part in the wider story of the battle. What would have happened if Young and his loyal Naga soldiers had not fought so ferociously at Kherson and held up General Sato's advance for as long as they did? It's more than possible that the entire story of the battle would have been very different. The Japanese may have managed to push themselves into the Brahmaputra Valley, directly threatening India in a way that far exceeded their initial aspirations for the offensive. What is certain is that John Young knew nothing of the implications or otherwise of attending to his duty. He accepted the task that he had been given and willingly sacrificed himself for the lives of his men in an act that, in my view, as an historian at least, was to decisively benefit the British and Indian soldiers defending India from attack. But he has received no recognition of any kind for any act of gallantry and devotion to duty, rarely surpassed in the annals of British military history. His sacrifice went unknown in the country for whom he died, except to his native soldiers, who talked of him as the embodiment of the empire they so respected and honored. In 2011, as chairman of the Kohima Educational Trust, I was privileged to attend the unveiling of a plaque in Glasgow to this remarkable young man, the only public recognition he has ever received. On the memorial at the entrance to the cemetery in Kohima, where he lies buried, the inscription reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." I've often pondered the nature of John Young's sacrifice. When he committed to defending that trench on his own after sending his men to safety, he knew what the end would be. He wasn't there to surrender, but to die. He knew the consequences of his decision, or so he thought. He thought the consequence would be that he would be killed, and by so doing would be known as a man who knew his duty and did it. But he could never know the bigger picture that his obedience to his orders meant, far beyond his own life and the situation in that lonely mountain village of Kherson. His sacrifice meant liberty for many others. At the very least, it meant delay for Sato's legions as they pressed on towards Kohima. And it undoubtedly gave the frantically preparing defenders at Kohima, outnumbered 10-1, precious time to complete their defenses. We know now that when Sato launched his attacks on Kohima, he did so piecemeal, taking several days to gather his strength. That this was so was due in part to John Young and his young native soldiers of A Company, 1st Battalion, the Assam Regiment. This was something of which Young was never to know, that his bravery and his selfless sacrifice had such extraordinary consequences. Christ died for his friends. John Young, too, died for his. Tonight, as we celebrate the start of Lent in 2021, think on this. Don't worry that what you're offering up at Lent in terms of voluntary sacrifice doesn't add up to much. As Christians, we're called to obedience and need to be prepared to give without understanding what the consequences might be. Leave that to God. The greatest act of our humanity, I believe, is to offer ourselves in sacrifice to others. And that's what we're doing in a small way at Lent. Christ, God's Son, sacrificed himself for suffering humanity. And John Young thought nothing of doing the same for his friends, even in the terror and the tumult of battle. What are we going to offer in terms of the sacrifice we're prepared to make this Lent? And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you very much indeed for telling such an exciting story. It is full of drama, but also some mystery there. I love the fact that you gave us maps, quite detailed maps. You talked us through the the terrain and how that sort of really set the scene for the act of great bravery and heroism. But you also had your own pictures, so we got the sense of that you are personally connected with this story, and that sort of nail-biting finish that you said that the order to fight to the last man and the last bullet was in fact rescinded, but that Young himself wasn't in a position to hear that, and therefore he pressed on with this effectively an out-of-date order, continuing to obey it, and as a result, made a massive impact. I mean, you didn't quite go as far as to say he single-handedly saved the whole of India, but you pretty strongly hinted at it, which makes him an absolute hero. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to encourage people to send questions. Rob's very kindly said that he'll take questions on any aspect of what he said. You can ask him questions about general historical principles or other aspects of history. And of course, you can ask him and probe some of the links that Rob has made between the sacrifice of Captain John Young and the sacrifice of Jesus, which obviously we commemorate week by week at the churches, and of course the sacrifice of Lent. So do feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can, as I said this before, you can send to everyone, and that means everyone will get to see your question, or if you like, you can send it just to me or just to Rob, and then we'll read it out so that it can be answered. And we'll spend as long on this as we need to. So do get the questions coming in. I've got one to start things off, Rob, if I may, which is right from the word go at the start of your. I wrote down the question: how do you know all this? And and I was thinking, is this a well-known story? And then right at the end, you said this is a completely unknown story, and at least until very, very recent days. So I guess there's a number of things from that. One, yeah, how did you find out about it? But two, it's just a tantalizing suggestion that there may be dozens of other stories just like that which have not yet been heard. Can you tell us something about that?
I can indeed. Thank you, Andrew. And actually, I'm going to answer another question first, which is the point that you made about, could it possibly be the case that one man or a small number of men or one incident impacted so significantly on the shape of a battle? And we often think of battles as being large, extraordinarily extensive events that involve thousands and thousands of men and sometimes women and so on. And yet the reality is battles often fall, the success or failure of battles often fall on a small number of people, and decisions made by a small number of people and a small number of events. And I have been studying this particular series of battles in Assam and Manipur now for perhaps 25 years. And I'm completely confident that this particular battle at Karasom, combined with the battle in the north at Jessamy, and further south at a place called Sangshak, decided the entire the fate of the Japanese invasion of India. So yes, John Young did play, and his young Naga soldiers and the other soldiers in the Assam regiment in Jessamy played a very significant role in the defeat of the Japanese. And as I suggested, they didn't know what the consequences of their obedience were. How do I know about this? Well, I am a military historian, and I have been studying the subject for a while, but John Young's story in particular is still completely unknown. It was first written up in the history of the Assam regiment by an officer who had served in the regiment during the war, Peter Stein. And that particular story was then picked up in two other accounts of the Battle of Kohima, most recently by my friend Fergal Keane in his book Road of Bones. But I've also visited Jessamy and Karasom and looked at the territory. I am a trustee of the Kohima Educational Trust, which was set up by British soldiers after the war to to as an act of gratitude, actually, to the Naga people for the support the Nagas gave to the British during the battle. And I was chairman for a number of years, and I'm simply a working trustee now. I go out every year. And it's meeting John Young soldiers, for instance, in 2011, the men who told me the story of John Young's remarkable sacrifice. And Savahu Ninu, who sadly passed away last year, was telling me through an interpreter, actually, he couldn't speak English, how they were aghast at Captain Young's decision to stay where he was and to fight the Japanese on his own. They tried to encourage him over several hours to come back with them to Kohima. And he said, we don't know exactly what he said, but Savahu Ninu, who ended up being a Naik, a corporal in the Indian Army, said that he made it very clear to them where his duty lay. And that really makes the story quite an extraordinary one. John Young was in no doubt about what he was being asked to do and what he was determined to do, which was to commit his life in sacrifice for a cause of which he had little understanding other than duty. Now, isn't that extraordinary?
Wow. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Rob, I think you've in the course of that answer, I think you've picked up a question that was asked just a couple of minutes ago in the chat. What brings you to travel to this site in India every year? So you said it's about the Kohima Educational Trust, and your link to that, is that from your army days?
Just I was, yes. Well, no,
not
a
little bit about your army career. What regiment were you in, and what did
you do? I was commissioned in 1980. I joined the army in 1981, and I was commissioned into a regiment called the Light Infantry in 1982. That regiment is now called the Rifles. And my son, who's 24, is now an officer in the Rifles. So he's followed his father into the army. I only really became interested, I became knowledgeable about Kohima when I was preparing my PhD, which was on Field Marshal Bill Slim, the famous general who commanded the 14th Army, the victorious army in Burma India in 1944 and Burma in 1945. And part of that victory, of course, was Kohima. And I went out to visit Kohima on my own, and then spent quite a number of years interviewing veterans, both in India and Britain, and met Gordon Graham. And Gordon Graham had been a major, and then finally Lieutenant Colonel before he left the army in 1946 in the Cameron Highlanders. And he was talking about setting up with some of the other veterans, the Kohima Educational Trust, and invited me to join as a trustee. That was 2004. And I've remained with the Kohima Educational Trust ever since. And uniquely as a trust, we don't exist to support veterans or their families. We exist to support the families of people in Nagaland who didn't want this war, who had no say in this war arriving in their beautiful hilltop towns and villages, and who suffered terribly as a result of the Second World War. So this charity is a very small way of saying thank you to people who helped Britain in its hour of need way back in 1944.
Thank you very much. We're getting a number of questions coming through in the chat now, which is tremendous. Do keep sending them in, folks. And what I will try and do is to moderate a little bit. So I'll try and bring together questions that belong together. It's interesting, there are questions going off in a number of different directions now. One about recognition for heroes, which I think we might come back to in a bit. One about just the significance of Young in the whole India story and the Battle of Kohima. I want to take it though on a more sort of reflective, perhaps less historical direction. My colleague Victoria down at St Mark's says, on the subject of obedience, how do we now discern what to be obedient to? And this relates to another question, which was just about the nature of that that sort of terrifying command to fight to the last man and to the last bullet, which, as we've said, was rescinded, but not effectively. I mean, you served in the British Army, Robert. Are such orders routinely given today? I mean, would people going to the army, can they contemplate a time when they too would be commanded to fight for the last man and the last bullet, or was that just a Second World War thing? So something about the nature of our obedience and the kind of obedience that is expected of us, particularly perhaps with the start from the military perspective and then broaden it out if you'd like to.
Well, it's a great question. The truth is there is no such thing as a fight to the last round and the last bullet. They're called rounds in the army. The last round and the last man. But it's reflective of an attitude of mind. And it's very interesting. I've read this in a number of places where men have described, they're in a defensive position, they're under attack, they have no choice but to continue fighting. And there is no idea in their minds that they should run away, because their obligation, their duty is to fight. And if that fighting means it ends in their death or in their wounding, then so be it. That's what they're there for. That's what soldiers are for. So to fight to the last bullet in the last round and the last man is just a phrase descriptive of commitment. It's not an order to do that without intelligence. And even if that order had not been rescinded, it was an actual order, by the way, but even if the order had not been rescinded, John Young, of course, would not have been punished for withdrawing in good order from Kherson because his duty had been completed. But in my view, the order which came from Bruno Brown, I know Bruno Brown's family, and I've read his account of the battle, it wasn't an order that was directing John Young to fight fruitlessly until he was killed. It was a reinforcement of the commitment to do his duty. And I think that's exactly what all soldiers expect. All soldiers expect that there is a tough end of soldiering and a brutal end. And sometimes when the bullets start flying, you have to complete your duty. That's what you're trained to do. You're trained to keep on going. And there are so many parallels here with the spiritual world that it's not funny. The life of a soldier is very much a life of discipline and obedience. And so too is the Christian life. And, I'm a committed Christian. I have been since I was 11 or 12. And I chuckle to myself sometimes when I think about this life of obedience as a soldier. And of course, in the Bible, it's often remarked upon, is it not, that Christian obedience is very much like military obedience. But it is quite an extraordinary thing that John Young and the nature of heroes, I'll just briefly mention this. The heroes are largely the people we look back on and determined to be heroes. Of course, there are many soldiers who die in battle for whose story is completely forgotten and disappears because no one was there to observe it, or those who did observe it have subsequently died. So it's a very, very tough thing. The reality is John Young's, formally in the British and Indian armies, John Young's sacrifice is not recognized. It's not recognized by the award of a military cross or any other decoration. It's only understood now because men like Savihu Ninu, one of his corporals, came back to Kohima and said, "You will not believe that Captain Young stayed there at his post to allow us to escape, and he took on the Japanese by himself." That's how we know about the story. And we've done, a number of historians have done a bit more work on it. But that story, John Young's story, could be multiplied thousands of times through the history of war. And it's only those whose heroism has perhaps been seen by others and remarked on that is recorded, and a very tiny fraction of those men who do these amazing deeds of valor are ever formally recognized for what they achieve. Sorry, carry on.
Thank you. Well, there's a question about sort of, I guess, history catching up, which is that this is, I'll just read it out. Is there any precedent for someone being honoured so many years later? You can answer that one, but it sounds as though Young should be now that his story is known. And I guess that, again, trying to take it as a wider historical point, I mean, are you keen on the idea of kind of going back over things and righting now wrongs that were from a long time ago, such as honouring those people? Do you want to campaign for John Young to
no.
And why not?
Well, I do understand the imperative. I do understand the emotion behind it. And believe me, as a soldier who's seen bullets fly, I feel it. I feel the importance of it. But the reality is this sort of bravery needs to be recognized at a number of levels. I'm doing it, a number of other historians are doing it. We're doing it tonight because we're talking about it. We're reflecting on this extraordinary human commitment that's reflective itself of God's commitment to us. And as I made the point that we're all made in the image of God, and God's given us the ability to be obedient. He's given us the ability to think these things through. But I think that the decision about heroes and not are decisions for the time. And the reason I think that is because it's very easy to rewrite history, and it's a very, very dangerous thing to do. So I would say now that there are probably three sources of this story, and one of them is mine. Now, that's not the proper objective evaluation of heroism we require. But I'd say something else, which is that heroism is not simply being awarded a military cross or a Victoria Cross. He certainly was worthy of at least the military cross and possibly also the Victoria Cross. But remembrance of heroes is exactly the stuff that we're doing now. And it's the stuff that I'm proud to do in a small way as an historian. And that in itself, I think, is recompense. And we, a number of trustees 10 years ago had this debate ourselves about what was the best way of remembering John Young. And we've discovered that it was actually relatively simple. We spoke to people in Glasgow. We spoke to the council, Glasgow City Council. We spoke to Hillhead High School. We spoke to people who knew his family. And all of a sudden, John Young's name now is very well known, much wider known than it ever was, because we started talking about gossiping the story is the best way of getting the story of John Young out there and ensuring that it's not forgotten.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Do you keep sending your questions in, folks? Question there, possibly someone might want to ask the broader question on rewriting history. We've had a number of instances in the last year or two where people have tried to rewrite things. We could ask our lecturer what he thinks about that. Rob, we've got questions about, well, there's a little factual one about the Chindits, who I think were in Burma, but you tell us a bit about who the Chindits were. Moira is asking, was this the only reason why the Japanese didn't invade India? I mean, are you overplaying this, Robert? I mean, this is not another. Given that the Japanese swept through Malaya in a matter of weeks, 7th of December to 15th of February for Singapore.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have thought that India should have been easy for them, particularly, the very, very sparsely populated areas. You're saying that the sacrifice of this man basically prevented the Japanese from taking over the whole of India. Is that pretty fair?
I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying that his sacrifice was a very significant part in the Japanese defeat. If the battles of Karasom and Jessamy had not taken place, the battle at Kohima, which really did define and determine the end of the Japanese invasion of India, would have been much, much more difficult. But it is important to understand that in 1942, when the Japanese pushed the British out of Burma rather, they were exhausted. There was no way that the Japanese could ever have carried on into India, and they recognized that themselves. But in 1943, we had the first Chindit expedition under Brigadier Ord Wingate into Burma, and that persuaded the Japanese that actually crossing the hills into the Brahmaputra Valley, certainly into Imphal and possibly beyond, was doable. And Mutaguchi Renya, commander of the 15th Army, who had first been opposed to the idea of invading India, in 1943 changed his mind, and one thing led to another. His massive invasion of about 115,000 troops in March 1944, which is a very, very significant event in itself. We don't have time to go into this. Suffice to say, I've got a very big book coming out of the India that describes a lot of this, called A War of Empires. But this is not an advertisement for that. It's important to say that in 1944, the Japanese didn't really intend to invade India. They intended to invade Manipur and Assam for their own purposes, which was to prevent the British from re-invading Burma. And at the same time that this great battle was taking place, Ord Wingate's second expedition was underway in northern Burma. those operations were designed in part to prevent and reduce the impact of the Japanese invasion, but also to support the operations of the American Lieutenant General Vinegar J. Stilwell and his Chinese army in northern Burma, moving down through the jungles to Myitkyina. It's an entirely separate story and will take several hours to cover. But yes, the Chindits were an integral part of the operations to fight the Japanese and defeat the Japanese in 1944. And in fact, a Chindit brigade, the 23rd Long Range Penetration Brigade, was operating just after the time of John Young's sacrifice through April, May, and June, and actually to July, all the way around this territory through Karasom and Jessamy and down to Ukral, chasing the Japanese, so operating behind their lines. And one of my most wonderful ever veteran friends, a Christian long gone to glory, called Philip Brownless, was a soldier or a young officer in the 23rd Brigade in the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment. And he's told me lots of stories, which I've recorded, of the operations in the jungle. And one of the most amazing series of stories he tells is about, he was a keen Christian at the time. He was studying theology at Cambridge when he was called up to the army, went off to the army, went to Tobruk and then Burma, and then went back and completed his theological training after the war, after which he became a vicar. And he said the most amazing thing was going to a Naga village and singing Christian hymns with the Nagas, them singing in Nagamese or their Naga language, Ngami or whatever it was, and he and his boys singing in English. He said it didn't matter that we were singing different words, the tunes were the same.
Thank you very much, Rob. You said you don't want to plug your books, but actually it would be lovely if you would like to plug your books briefly.
Well, there are quite a few. You can find me on the internet at www.robertlyman.com. I started my research in the Far East with a biography of Bill Slim, which is called Slim Master of War, published in 2004. And I'm just about to publish a big book called A War of Empires, which is an attempt to bring the whole of the war in the Far East, 1942 to 45, together from a narrative perspective, and to answer some of the questions that you've answered here. It's 200,000 words, it's big, but there will be pictures in it, and I'll put some maps in as well, so that'll be helpful.
Thank you very much. I mean, one of the disadvantages of not being able to host you live in our building is that I know you would have been able to bring along copies of your book. We could have had a look at them, and people would have been. I think on your Wikipedia entry it lists something like 15 published works. That's probably only the major ones. You've how many actual books?
I think it's probably 16 or 17 or something. What actually I do like telling people is that in 2010 I helped General Lord Dannatt write his book, Leading from the Front. And Richard Dannatt's a very keen Christian and a good friend. And we are embarking on another writing adventure together soon, later this year. Well, as soon as I can get some of my other commitments behind me, we'll start writing a book which tells the story of the British Army between victory in 1918 and defeat in Europe in 1940. So we're trying to create the link between the end of the First World War and the start of the Second World War. And that's going to be a real adventure. But so I've focused heavily on the war in the Far East, but I've also spent quite a bit of time looking at the nature of soldiering and command in North Africa on a book in Tobruk. And I've also had a little bit of fun writing books on commando raids in Europe as well, not least of all the fabulous Kokosho Heroes, and which is called Operation Suicide, and the amazing raid on Saint Nazaire in 1942 into the jaws of death. And you can find them all online if you wish. There's just one book actually I could plug if I may, which is called Among the Headhunters, which is the story of a Naga tribe in a village called Panksha in 1936. And it's a fascinating story because this was a tribe that continued to carry out its wicked headhunting attacks on other villages. It was a very big and brutal village. And the British marched in 1936 to put a stop to this headhunting and burnt part of the village down. A bit of a close run thing, but quite an extraordinary trip. And then in 1943, an American C-46 aircraft, which was flying on the hump route from Lido in India and the northern Brahmaputra Valley to Chongqing in Yunnan province in China, crashed. And it happened to crash over Pangsha. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the end of the story was, but here we've got a whole bunch of Americans parachuting for the first time. It remains the largest involuntary parachute jump in history, jumping from the stricken C-46 and floating out under their silken canopies over a village of headhunters. What do you think happened? Well, you're going to have to read the book. It's called Among the Headhunters. And I've been to Pangsha. It's a great place and it's an extraordinary story, and I'm sure you will like it.
Wow, gosh, I'm waiting not just for the book but for the film to follow that up. Very good.
So
Well, we've had a few more. I think we'll try and squeeze in just a few more questions, if we may, folks. I'm not going to keep you late into the evening because I know Zoom is pretty exhausting to watch on Zoom. It would be much easier if this were a live event. But we have had a number of good questions. We're going to try and make you squirm a little bit, if we may, Robert. Do you think that your reason for being attracted to the story of John Young is to do with the fact that self-sacrifice in the service of others is the Christian story, and as a Christian you're attracted, or is it because you, as a former British Army officer, are attracted to stories of heroism by British Army officers, or is it a bit of both? Or are you kind of those things?
It's a little bit of both, but the second one, I would simply say that I'm attracted to stories of human sacrifice and human heroism. I am. I mean, it's a fact of life. Many years ago, I came to the conclusion that what we describe as common grace is built into our DNA. God built it into our DNA in order to be able to understand Christian sacrifice, God's sacrifice. It only makes sense if we can experience it ourselves. And I had gone
just to briefly explain common grace, there may be a few people here who are not familiar with the phrase.
Common grace basically means, I'm not a theologian, but the way I understand it is that when God has made humankind in his image, he has given us his attributes, his characteristics, and we express those whether we have a personal faith in Christ or not. That's almost irrelevant. We are all made in the image of God, and we all demonstrate his characteristics. And one of those, of course, the fundamental characteristic of Christianity, actually published in a fantastic book called Dominion last year. And I really do urge everyone who can, if you haven't read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, which is basically the story of love, God's love through the Christian faith. It's the story of the church and how it's transformed the way in which all of humankind thinks about itself. Anyway, let's not go there. So common grace is about us expressing God's attributes. So the truth is, I am attracted to those. Yes, I think I understand John Young's sacrifice and I understand what he did because I'm a Christian. It doesn't mean that I understand it better than anyone else. That's not the case at all, but I am attracted to it. But I'm attracted to all forms of sacrifice, and not just by British Army officers, because it is an extraordinary expression of our humanity.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Might provoke one or two other side questions on there. Someone's asking about kind of the up-to-date picture. Given your interest in that part of the world, Burma is obviously very much in our thoughts at the moment. Very recent news from Burma. Do you keep up at all with things there, other than just what we all hear in the news? Have you got an insight into how we can help the situation in Burma now?
Yes, I do. I've got a number of friends who live in Myanmar, or Burma, as many the Burmese still call it. Myanmar was the name given to the country in 1988 by the military junta, and it's not universally recognized as the name of the country. But nevertheless, yes, I am keeping in touch with what's going on, and it's dreadful. The country was settling down in fits and starts to its new freedoms in the last few years, and those have been taken away very quickly. So there's very little we can do apart from remain concerned, demonstrate the concern by writing to your MP, by becoming knowledgeable about what's going on, and of course as Christians by praying. We believe in the power of prayer, and it's important that Christians continue praying for the situation in Myanmar, and certainly for the security of my friends there, and for the future state of the country. It's incredibly important that we, it does remain at the forefront of our thoughts and our concern. It's been under draconian rule for very many years, and the country was opening up, and it looks as though the door's closing on that, certainly for the time being.
Thank you. Yeah, praying for Myanmar. Great thing for Christians to do. We've had we did touch on this earlier on, the idea of sort of revisionist approach to history. We've had streets renamed, removal of statues, and so on. Obviously, every historian, including every armchair historian, has a view on that. I wondered whether you wanted to reflect on it briefly, just from a Christian perspective.
Yes.
Specifically thinking whether is there something going on here in the nature of repentance? By the way, we've got people here tonight from various churches around Bromley. There may be people here who are not from churches as well, more historians than theologians. So maybe a bit of something about repentance. And does that question turn on that for you as a historian who is also a Christian?
It is such a great question. Okay, so very briefly, I don't think it's generally a good idea to implant our current views on the views of the people who put up statues. But that argument only goes so far. There is no doubt whatsoever that some of the statues of individuals, some of the individuals rather represented by statues around the country are bad eggs. But we just need to remember we're all bad eggs. We're all a mix of good and bad. We're all sinners. We're all saved by grace. And those who don't believe in Christ are still made in the image of God. We don't believe that there is anyone out there apart from Christ who is entirely virtuous. So the idea of pulling a statue down because someone at one stage supported the slave trade or owned a slave is a very difficult thing to work through, because people change their minds, people's views were different, and at different stages in their careers. And we also do know that balance is an important element in any debate. And unfortunately, in my view, certainly around the BLM debates in the last 12 months, in the public debate, a lot of balance has not been obvious. And it's really important. I'm not leaping to judgment. I'm simply saying that if we are going to have a series of policy decisions made in this country, they need to be made on the basis of debate, intelligent, informed debate. That's the way we've traditionally done things in this country. I'm not particularly a great fan of statues, but I'm even less of a fan of modern political movements placing their beliefs in the minds and mouths, in the mouths of people who lived in previous centuries. And that's the important thing about history. Context is all. In all my books, anyone who opens one of my books will spend the first half of the book getting to understand the context of the decisions that were made, because it's only in the context that we actually understand people. So the final thing I would say about that is we are all, whether we like it or not, political people. We are, I was going to say political animals. I don't believe we're animals. I believe that we're made in the image of God. But we're small political people, because we all have opinions. We all have political views. And I think the importance about debate, certainly in this country, and BLM as an example, is that all aspects of all views need to be held up and presented and considered, rather than simply the views of a particular lobbying group. And that's really, really important. It's one of the reasons why we have Parliament, of course.
Thank you very much. You may have fired off a number of things in people's minds, and I guess we could have many evenings discussion on those points alone. There's a question that says, are there other good events going on at St John's in the near future? And I have a feeling that question is aimed perhaps more at me than at you. So perhaps you'll excuse me for a moment if I just answer that question from whoever, submitted by someone called Andrew the Vicar. Oh, that's me. We do have other things going on at St John's, and we try and make sure we've got good food for thought every single week at St John's, Sunday by Sunday. Those of you who are members of St John's, I hope you'll feel that's the case. If you're a member of another church joining us tonight, we are thrilled to have you as our guests. If you're here tonight and you're not a member of any particular church, then come along and give us a try. We've got an events page on our website where you can see everything going on at St John's. And this Tuesday, we're beginning a Lent course, which is for all the churches of Central Bromley, called My Favourite Hymn, which has got a bit of a historical perspective to it, because we're looking back at the history of hymn writing. We'll look at a few specific hymn writers and their work, and we're using that as a way to reflect on some of the great truths of the Bible which these hymn writers set to music or responded to in their music. So that's Tuesday night. It starts via Zoom, and if you go to our webpage, you can find the Zoom link there. In 3 weeks' time, it's Mothering Sunday, and it's never too early to start planning for Mothering Sunday. Those of us who've got mothers still alive, we might like to remember those. Those of you who are mothers, you might like to drop a hint to your children. 3 weeks' time, we've got a family service on that day, and we're looking forward to having people at that, which we hope will be live in our building. Just waiting to see what the Prime Minister announces tomorrow, but we're hoping to be back there. I think we've probably extracted a huge amount of value out of Robert this evening, and I think we probably need to let him take the rest of the evening off. Can I just say, Robert, on behalf of all of us, I think it's been an absolutely fascinating evening. You've found a brilliant story, and you've told it with just wonderfully engaging style. And I think a number of us are inspired. I'm inspired to go. I love reading books of history, but I'm inspired to go and read some more about the Second World War, which is not a subject I know very well at all. So thank you very much for that. Thank you as well for reflecting on these themes with a specifically Christian perspective, which I think will be a great news for us. So, folks, I'm going to invite you all to unmute so that our lecturer can hear the well-deserved round of applause. Dr. Robert Lyman.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. It's been a real privilege to speak to you tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, folks. God bless you, and hope to see you soon. Good night.